Hello and welcome to another edition of the Pink Sheet's Farmer Regulatory Podcast. I'm Derek Gingery, a senior writer at the Pink Sheet, and I'm joined by fellow senior writer Sarah Carlin Smith and executive editors Bowman Cox and Nielsen Hobbs. Today is May 21st, 2021, and we're here in Washington still looking out for the Brood X cicadas. Surprisingly, despite all the hype, I've only seen one of them. But we also were on the lookout this week for the lawmakers interested in grilling emergent biosolutions following the quality problems that emerged at its Baltimore plant making coronavirus vaccines. Bowman, you covered the hearing for us. What were your big takeaways?
Well, and just to refresh everyone's memory, this all started with the viral vector cross-contamination incident that came to light earlier this year, where virus from the AstraZeneca vaccine that they were making at the plant appeared in a lot of Johnson & Johnson vaccine that they were also making there. The hearing, this was the House Select Coronavirus Crisis Subcommittee, and it was really focused on why the Trump administration issued such a large task order to Emergent to produce these vaccines, given its record of quality issues. And the hearing was interesting because Emergent pointed out that in their view, the problem was the fact that the facility had sort of a funding drought over the years and all of a sudden had to ramp up staffing and operations in a way that just was not likely to go well, basically. And this raises a question about standby production capacity for pandemics or other crises, and it really goes back to two visions for how to do that. The one is a boutique government sector that stands at the ready. This was the vision that really came out of the Obama administration in response to the H1N1 pandemic, and that's when they, established their arrangement with Emergent Biosolutions. And then the other vision really dates back to World War II, and hasn't really been used since the Korean War, which is the Defense Production Act, where the government just basically takes private sector capacity and puts it to government use. So we're going to really start to see which vision worked best, what other visions might work better. And this is going to start with lessons learned. And so what we heard today was the lesson from the Emergent situation. But, there were many other ramp ups that occurred that we haven't really looked at. For example, Moderna went 0 to 60 with their vaccine, and things seem to go pretty well from what we know. Pfizer had some challenges, but overall, they had a great ramp up. And there are other ones to look at that haven't been looked at yet. The way Gilead ramped up their remdesivir production, and then also the COVID therapeutics at Regeneron and Lilly and Merck. So it's going to be interesting to see what we learn from all this and how we apply it in terms of the next pandemic. But I just wanted to also point out that there's a big takeaway about risk. I mean, in the middle of the crisis, everyone took huge risks. When Congress passed the CARES Act, they removed a lot of the guardrails that are normally in place to prevent any sort of, questionable contracting practices. The government exercised the discretion that they were given. Industry manufactured at risk. Now the crisis has passed, and we're in the Monday morning quarterbacking phase, which is a much more comfortable place to be. Hopefully, they'll come out of this with some lessons learned that they can actually apply to the next pandemic. before everyone forgets about this problem and moves on to other things.
Yeah, that's interesting, Bowman. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me was, and you mentioned this a little bit, was that, Emergent was one of these facilities that was kind of identified a while ago as being, like kind of like surge capacity, or whatever you want to call it. And they were saying that's fine, we'll be ready, but then they said we didn't get enough work from you guys to be ready when we were called on. So I guess I get a little confused at what they were, what the problem with that was, but maybe that's just, I don't know, maybe I just don't understand it fully.
Right. They seem to sort of be saying like they have to be sort of working all the time to like right, that there is no like sort of keeping things going so you're ready. You either have to give us work so well, sir, we kind of already are at that capacity, or it's going to take more time than you want for us to be able to, safely get to the higher surge level.
Right. I mean, that's the challenge with this approach. And I think one aspect that people don't really think about is what's involved in having a smooth running manufacturing operation. I mean, it's the kind of a process that sort of, it works best when it's sort of continuing and you have people there that have been working together and know each other and know how they work and they know the process, and day in and day out it's pretty much the same thing day after day. So anytime when you have a ramp up, it's not going to be like that, but maybe you have teams there that have already been working together on other things. But here was a case where apparently they just had to throw a lot of people into a situation, and it was really challenging to get to that point. And it was difficult in some of the other products. I think they all. I think the Pfizer vaccine did not hit their initial targets because it was slower than expected, or at least hoped for, in their ramp up. But they got there. But Emergent, they really struggled. It was interesting that the company put the blame for some of their problems on one of their clients, AstraZeneca. Last fall, there were some contamination issues with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they said that it was because when they got the tech transfer order from the company, it kept changing, that there was like 80 changes that they had to deal with. And again, that's all part of the process with these vaccines. They're ramping up production as they're working on development, and that means that the process, it's they have processes that were not really completely locked down. So it was a challenge all around.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder if you want to have, and maybe this is something that in-house manufacturing goes through too, but I mean, it just makes you wonder if kind of contract manufacturers are the best way to kind of be able to do these type of ramp ups. I mean, especially when you're talking about 80 process changes. I mean, that, I don't know much about manufacturing, but that sounds like a lot to me. And, internally, maybe you could handle that better because you have the experts that are, there all the way through development that could, smooth the way to get those done.
Yeah, I just don't think that we realize yet how challenging it was to produce these vaccines the way they did. And, it's starting to come out now what these companies went through to accomplish this. And, some succeeded, some had problems. There's a lot of lessons learned, but the whole thing was extraordinary.
I was going to say, I remember talking to someone who used to lead a lot of manufacturing efforts at Merck related to vaccines very early on in the pandemic. And the person was kind of saying, it might take normally like 8 to 9 months or something like that just for FDA to kind of inspect a manufacturing facility normally for these types of products and approve it. So, I mean, right, kind of echoing what Bowman is saying, but you have, I mean, obviously more expertise in this. These are these are not things that normally happen at this speed and for a reason, right? In terms of how challenging it is and how many, places there are where you could go wrong. So, in some ways, I wonder almost if you could think about this in the same way some people were talking about the, the catching, the adverse events with the J&J shot, that this is sort of a sign of how careful we've been to make sure people get quality products to some extent.
Right. I mean,
This was all kind of caught and it didn't go out that way.
Right. I mean, and that's another part of it, is not only how they were able to ramp up the production, but they were able to do it with all the quality processes in place so that when things went wrong, they caught them. So it's pretty amazing. And that's what having a good quality system is. It's not about not having problems necessarily. It's about being sure that when there are problems, you catch them and you deal with them. And we've seen that throughout this whole process of companies doing that. So overall, I think it's been a great effort. But it's good to look back and getting back to Emergent Biosolutions. I mean, maybe their idea is that the government should just keep them at this high funding level going forward until the next pandemic. That's great for them. But the reality is that there has to be some better model. And it's interesting that, despite all of its flaws, the Defense Production Act approach at least gives you a way to sort of like commandeer a facility where they already have teams in place that are used to working together, that have proven that they know how to make product correctly and do it all the time, and say, look, we need you to stop what you're doing and turn your attention to this vaccine. And, maybe that's a better way to do it.
Well, certainly industry has not been a big fan of the Defense Production Act. I don't know if that's sort of more a philosophical objection to the idea that sort of the government's deciding what gets made and what doesn't, or if it's sort of a convenient defense for their IP argument, saying that the real problem isn't so much the patents, but that the U.S. is sort of gobbling up all the supply issues. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. President Biden just this week, in his speech on donating vaccines, said that he was hoping to ramp up domestic production for the next time. But as you're saying, Bowman, it seems like they've got to figure out kind of how best to maintain that excess capacity if they really want to be faster next time.
Right, and I'm sure they're going to learn the lessons from it. I just hope that the public and the Congress in the administration are focused on that at the point in time when they can actually lay out the plan for preparing for the next pandemic. I do worry that everyone will move on to other things and then just let it sit there and fester until all of a sudden it's a problem again.
Yeah, that's one of the good things about the coming out of the pandemic is we all learned a little more about vaccine and pharmaceutical manufacturing, which is something that I'm sure all of us studied in college and in grade school, and the key thing is we need to remember this past next week as opposed to just moving on to the next thing, like you said. So
right, I would just mention that one of the things that really annoyed the pharmaceutical industry last year was the HHS initiated an effort to invent the next generation version of the Strategic National Stockpile, which is where all of this government production of vaccines and medicines and so forth technically goes to. And they were asking industry to really think through what the next generation should look like at a time when everybody was working 24/7 dealing with this pandemic. But now you can see why, because that's when everybody was focused on the question and when you could actually get something done. Now, when there's going to be more time to figure out the next generation, I just hope that the public is, the country is attentive enough to it to actually put the money into it and think it through and establish that system.
Yeah, the FDA is going through some of the same kind of after action analysis too. I mean, there was a former commissioner this week called for an independent commission to look into that in addition to the internal one. So, yeah, this is one of those things that you want the focus to remain on it, but then you also want you want to have like 5 minutes to kind of take a breath, before we start thinking about it again.
Exactly.
Well, next up is a rather unique move by the FDA to publicly rebuke a sponsor of an investigational COVID-19 treatment. Cytodyne has conducted 2 clinical trials for its monoclonal antibody leronlimab in COVID-19 and has requested an emergency use authorization. Its public statements have highlighted favorable subgroup analyses, sometimes at time points that were different from those that were pre-specified in the analysis plan. And on May 17th, the FDA took the extraordinary step of issuing a public statement saying that the trials of leronlimab did not support clinical benefit as a COVID-19 treatment. The FDA also noted that there was no clinically meaningful difference between study drug and placebo on the primary endpoint, which was total clinical symptom score, and none of the secondary endpoints were met. This is the second time in the last few months that the agency has done this. On March 2nd, CBER issued a statement on the Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics proposed ALS treatment, saying the trial failed to meet primary and secondary endpoints. So I'll open it up to the panel here. Do these 2 rebukes suggest the agency is taking a more proactive role in dealing with misleading corporate communications? Or maybe more importantly, do you think this will scare industry into ensuring their statements are completely accurate before they put them out?
My big question here, right, is sort of, is this kind of a slippery slope? And like, how does FDA sort of, I mean, there are a lot of people outside of industry, right, who have put pressure on FDA to be more transparent about what is happening with certain products pre-approval or, when CRLs are issued, for more transparency, particularly because, I think there've been a lot of cases where, investors and people felt very misled as to the progress of products. And then once FDA is able to weigh in, you get a very different take. So I guess my question is, right, like, how does FDA kind of justify the rules of the road here in terms of when they will weigh in or when they won't, and how can they, come back and say, oh no, we can't talk about this, when in some cases they are concluding they can. I mean, I know they sort of said there's like significant public interest here, and obviously a pandemic perhaps adds to it, though in Brainstorm's case, they certainly don't have that to fall back on. And again, I think there are groups of people who would argue, does it matter whether there's significant public, right? If you're the investor who's been put in a really horrible financial position because a company was not really being as truthful as they should be about accuracy, what they might make an argument that FDA should be more helpful there. So I guess I just kind of wonder how FDA sort of defends when they will or won't weigh in on these situations. It's kind of easier when they have this like very firm red line.
Yeah, they've usually said our hands are tied. Regulations prohibit us from discussing proprietary information until a certain point in the review, if it's the advisory committee or what have you. And they have said, oh, well, we might DM the SEC if we really see something that's, bad and that kind of thing. But now that they have, twice in recent months done this, the question is, kind of, if they haven't said something about a provocative press release, does that mean it's okay? And kind of what does that signal to investors? And, it does kind of create this risk of, this new standard of kind of, this imprint of FDA approval if they don't say something, given that they are starting to say things. And I think it's probably a big resource challenge for the agency to sort of be looking at all this stuff and deciding whether to weigh in. And it's probably not the kind of thing that they would get user fee funding for to have some sort of kind of press release police going out there and thinking about did you characterize your subgroups appropriately. I think the phrase you used, Sarah, slippery slope, is probably the right one. That we'd all like to see bad actors called out, but once you get into that business, or kind of what are the implications of it?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this playbook kind of employed here more. I mean, maybe it's more. I'm just noticing it more now than I have before. But where you kind of have some early data and it looks good, and you put out a rosy press release and you say it's really good, and then by the time you get to the point you're trying to kind of seemingly like build kind of public support and then public pressure kind of on the regulators to kind of do what you want. And I mean, maybe the FDA is kind of, is seeing the same thing, and they've kind of shown that, or they've kind of figured out a legally defensible way of dealing with that. Maybe, whether it's commenting on the statements that have already been made public, or the data that's already been made public, or whatever.
Bowman, one of the things that struck me as related was the story you did this week on the new guidance looking at complete response letters and pandemic delayed inspections. And FDA sort of made a point of saying that we will not issue a CRL simply because of delays, and that's what they've been saying for a while. But I'm curious if folks thought that maybe they were doing that because they were concerned that some companies may be sort of kind of implying that or trying to sort of cover up a problem by saying, oh, it's just pandemic-related delays. That may be sort of why we're getting that CRL. And sort of FDA was saying, no, we don't do complete response letters just because of pandemic-related inspection delays. I was just sort of kind of, it struck me as sort of kind of an interesting thing to emphasize at this juncture.
Right. I mean, we know that it's completely within a company's discretion to disclose what's in a complete response letter, and often there are multiple issues cited. And in this case, the inspection delay is mentioned in there, but as the FDA explained in the recent Q&A guidance document, the mention of it doesn't mean that it's actually one of the deficiencies that the complete response is about. Now, you do get the sense that maybe some companies have mischaracterized that. Certainly, it's preferable to focus on inspection issues rather than issues with the with clinical trials or the product itself. So I think your question is a good one, Matt.
That was my assumption reading the story.
Right.
I just sort of thought that that's why FDA was sort of issuing the warning, but maybe I've become too cynical.
Right. Well, that's the feeling I had too. So, and maybe it's just, industry will be, if companies have been a little fast and loose with that, hopefully they'll get the message and be more careful on it. Or, maybe they just didn't recognize the distinction there. It's perhaps a subtle distinction, and maybe they just didn't quite get it. But now the guidance is out. Everyone should understand it now.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of complaining about the inspections holding, the inability to do an inspection, or whatever you want to call it, holding up approvals. And maybe the FDA was just tired of hearing that people complain about why can't you come at why are you holding up my approval there when there's no problem with the facility. And they finally had to come up and say, hey, just because it's not just the pandemic, there's other things going on here.
Right. I mean, that's a real problem with these inspections, for sure.
It's another interesting thing to watch there as we move forward. Hopefully, a lot of the backlog and the pandemic related measures will lift pretty soon, and things can get closer back to normal. Finally, today is an update on version 2.0 of the 21st Century Cures Act, a bill intended to help new treatments reach patients faster. Sarah, you heard some comments from the bill's two primary sponsors on how they plan to proceed.
Right. So Representatives Diana DeGette and Fred Upton were talking about their legislation this week with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and they seem very kind of confident and excited that President Biden's ARPA-H, this Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, that they want to put, they're proposing in their budget to sort of put in NIH, and kind of would be a big boost for essentially like translational type research for the U.S. government. And they kind of see that as like a good hook to kind of attach cures with that and partner with Biden. They said the White House has kind of already talked with them about this. And for those who don't remember, really a big reason why at the end 21st Century Cures got across the finish line and got the Democratic support it really needed was because it got paired with Biden's cancer moonshot, and provided so much new government funding for research and so forth. There was a lot about 21st Century Cures I think Democrats were kind of wary of, and that sort of sweetener really pushed it over the edge, along with they ended up attaching some opioid money to it too. So I think they really see like history kind of repeating itself and this unique moment. And I mean, thinking back to when the initial 21st Century Cures effort first started, I think nobody really necessarily thought like, oh, there was going to be this big FDA bill done outside of a user fee year. And I think, of course, they sort of defied the odds and got this done. But I think still now people are like, okay, are they really going to be able to do it again? I mean, Upton doesn't have the same position on the Energy and Commerce Committee. He has to, have that extra leverage. He's no longer the chair of the committee. Obviously, COVID and all, the general kind of world dynamics, I think, have changed as well. And again, we're starting to get closer to another user fee package. So it does seem like it would be hard for them to kind of get this kind of magic together again. So, I think if they can make this work, I mean, that could really help ensure they get what they want done. I mean, they still also aren't like, ruling anything out. They said, that they'd be happy if they can't get it done that way to get it attached to user fees. They're very kind of pragmatic, I think, in a lot of ways. The other sort of interesting stumbling block I could kind of see happen here for them is that they're making this bill a bit more about access to medicines as opposed to like speeding up R&D and regulatory clearance. There's a little more focus on the payment side, but at the same time, the two of them clearly don't see eye to eye on drug pricing. So I guess like I could see them running into more political stumbles as this gets further along of like, creating complicated political issues if they get anywhere too close to the drug pricing debate. But at the other side of this, it can be kind of hard to improve access without going to that part of the conversation.
Well, I know they were mum on specifics, but other than the AR or AHRPAH or ARPA-H, I mean, was there any guess in kind of what sorts of things they could, put in the bill, or has there been any kind of like a laundry list of ideas that have come out for it yet?
DeGette has talked about a bit, again, about kind of somehow speeding up decisions from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on coverage once FDA grants access. So I think that's one thing they're looking at. Obviously they were talking at a regenerative medicine event, and those folks are kind of really pushing to get dedicated funding and assistance for CBER, but particularly for the cell and gene therapy sections there, and that seems like a reasonable possibility. They said they at least plan to do some sort of try and get like a report from the government on kind of the current state of regulations and challenges and so forth. So I think there's some hints of where they're going. They also I don't if again thinking back to the first 21st century cures, they did a very they got a lot of buy-in, I guess, from outside groups, and they did a lot of sort of listening sessions and formal processes where they solicited ideas, and they seem to really be kind of pushing for people to come to them and say to do some lobbying and say, look, we really understand this area better than you guys, because this is our work and bread and butter, and this tweak to this government regulation or law would be really important, or this flexibility would be really important. So they were pretty explicit, is there something in this kind of general space that you want done and need to be done? Come find us, work with us. And then on the flip side, I think they were saying, okay, and then once this all comes together, then we also want you to put the pressure on to get it done. So I think again they plan to kind of utilize a similar process to the bill, although again acknowledging that COVID circumstances I think makes it a little bit different. So we shouldn't expect the parade of hearings and so forth. And I think it'll be a little bit more of a condensed behind the scenes process. Even Upton was talking about how him and DeGette are at very different parts of the alphabet. So right now the way the House is voting because of COVID restrictions, they never see each other at votes. So that impacts a little bit of the dynamic of how they, how some of this work is getting done. So I thought that was sort of funny.
So we shouldn't expect any more of those 3-hour listening sessions that went on for months, I think, for at the beginning of the last process.
Right. I think they're hoping maybe to kind of avoid that, maybe potentially just for speed purposes, but I think some of it maybe is, pandemic purposes and other dynamics of the time. But like I said, at the same time, if you're one of those groups they might have invited to do that, I think they want to hear from you. It's just probably not going to be done in the same kind of public forum.
Yeah, I think the shift to secret Congress is usually a good sign for legislation. If you really want something to move, then making it through kind of very prominent makes it partisan, which makes it sort of difficult to move. I think the circumstances around the Cures Act, the first time sort of kind of with the passed through a lame duck Congress, with Democrats worried about what would happen with a Trump administration and a Republican Congress sort of doing something sort of beyond sort of kind of even what they were already uncomfortable with the initial version of the bills for kind of drove that. You could see sort of maybe a similar dynamic. It seems like the House is destined to go into Republican hands in the midterms, and perhaps the Senate as well. So I don't know if that's kind of encourage Democrats to kind of get on board with some stuff that might otherwise be concerned about. But it's always an interesting thing to watch when sort of two people across the aisle are working so closely on something like this.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when they're trying to do it for a second time. So it'll be interesting to see if they can get a package together and how they plan to move it. Well, that's all for this week. For more, check out our website at www.thepinksheet.com. You can also find this and previous podcast episodes on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, SoundCloud, and Spotify by searching for Pharma Intelligence. And if you're so inclined, feel free to give us a review. Thanks again for listening to the Pink Sheet Pharma Regulatory Podcast. I'm Derek Gingery with Sarah Carlin Smith, Bowman Cox, and Matt Hobbs. Stay safe, get vaccinated, and we'll see you next time.